Welcome to this Vishlashan, where we're going to dive into what is, honestly, one of the most incredible 2 decades in human history. We're talking about a 22-year epic that literally redrew the world map. I mean, think about it. How do you go from a tiny, persecuted group hiding in the desert to a massive, unified global power in just over 20 years? It's wild. The speed, the scale, it is absolutely unprecedented. So let's just jump right in and break down exactly how this happened, step by step. To help us navigate over 20 years of incredibly dense history, we're going to follow this roadmap. We'll start with early Arabia and Revelation, move right into persecution and the Hijra, cover the desperate battles for survival, then look at treaties and strategic expansion, the epic conquest of Mecca, and finally wrap up with the birth of a new global power.
All right, let's kick things off with Part 1, Early Arabia and Revelation.
So rewind your clocks to around 570 CE. The baseline of society back then, well, it was pretty grim. We're looking at an era plagued by extreme inequality, rampant idol worship, and honestly horrific practices, like burying infant daughters alive. But right in the middle of all this darkness stands the Prophet Muhammad. And what's absolutely crucial to know here is that he was deeply respected by his community for his profound honesty and integrity, long before he ever received his first revelation in a cave at age 40. When that message finally dropped, this massive shift from systemic, brutal injustice to a strict call for monotheism and social equity, well, as you can imagine, it set the stage for some serious, immediate friction.
Which brings us right into Part 2, Persecution and the Hijra.
Now, as this new revelation started gaining traction, it brought in fiercely devoted followers like Khadija and Ali, but it also created some incredibly powerful enemies like Abu Sufyan and Abu Jahl, who literally tortured the early converts. The year 619 CE was a crushing blow. The Prophet lost his beloved wife Khadija and his fiercely protective uncle Abu Talib. And with his main protectors gone, a massive, multi-tribal assassination plot was hatched. Forced to flee in the dead of night, he left his young cousin Ali in his bed as a decoy. Talk about bravery, right? After hiding out in the cave of Thor for 3 terrifying days, he made the Hijra, or the migration to Medina. For a tiny, vulnerable group of maybe 100 to 200 Muslims, forging this new mutual defense alliance in Medina was a critical turning point.
And that sheer survival instinct takes us to Part 3, the battles for survival.
What's really fascinating here is that these early Muslims weren't fighting for conquest. They were fighting simply to stay alive against absolutely overwhelming forces. Just picture the odds at their first major clash, the Battle of Badr. You have exactly 313 Muslims, equipped with a grand total of 8 swords and 2 horses. That's it. And they're staring down a heavily armed Meccan force of 1,000 soldiers. It sounds impossible, right? Yet they achieved this miraculous victory, which historical texts actually attribute to angelic intervention. It completely shattered the myth that the Meccans were invincible.
But that victory was just the beginning of a grueling, years-long timeline of survival. The Meccans came back furious a year later for revenge at the Battle of Uhud, and here the Muslims suffered devastating losses. Why? Because 35 archers abandoned their strategic posts on a hillside, mistakenly thinking they had already won the battle. That fatal slip-up allowed the Meccan cavalry to flank them. It was a bitter, costly lesson in discipline, but it led right up to their most brilliant defensive move yet in year 5. Okay, enter the Battle of the Trench. A terrifying coalition of 10,000 Meccans and their allies marched on Medina to wipe out the Muslims entirely. Outnumbered more than 3 to 1, the 3,000 defenders needed a miracle. And they got one through a totally unconventional tactic. A companion named Salman al-Farsi pitched a Persian strategy, digging a massive, continuous trench across the city's only vulnerable front. It was brilliant. It completely neutralized the enemy cavalry and stalemated a siege that, by all conventional military logic, should have destroyed them on day 1.
And these survival battles are just packed with high-stakes, character-driven drama. During that siege, a fearsome enemy champion actually managed to jump a narrow section of the trench and demanded single combat. Who steps up? A 27-year-old Ali ibn Abi Talib. Declaring himself a lion, Ali takes down this veteran warrior in a single strike. That massive psychological blow, combined with some brutal weather and collapsing alliances, actually forced the entire 10,000-strong enemy army to just pack up and retreat.
Which brings us to a major strategic shift in Part 4, treaties and strategic expansion. With Medina finally secure, the whole game shifted to geopolitics. The pivotal moment here is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The Prophet attempted a peaceful pilgrimage to Mecca but was blocked. Instead of fighting, though, he negotiated a 10-year peace agreement. Now, on paper, this treaty looked totally rigged against the Muslims. It literally said Muslims had to return Meccan converts, but Mecca didn't have to return Muslims. His followers were furious, but it was actually a strategic masterstroke. A rogue Meccan convert named Abu Basir, who was legally bound to be returned, just went and set up an independent camp right on the Meccan trade route. Soon, other escapees joined him, and they started economically choking Mecca by raiding their caravans. It got so bad that the Meccans themselves literally begged for that bias treaty clause to be canceled.
With the Meccan threat temporarily neutralized, the scale of conflicts just exploded. First, they secured their northern flank at Khyber, a heavily fortified stronghold where Ali famously unhinged the massive fortress door all by himself. Then things get really wild in Mu'tah. A small Muslim force of just 3,000 suddenly finds itself staring down an unbelievable 100,000 soldiers from the mighty Roman Empire. After 3 consecutive Muslim commanders were killed in action, the brilliant strategist Khalid bin Walid took charge. He orchestrated this masterful tactical retreat that completely tricked the massive Roman army and saved his men from total annihilation.
That sets the perfect stage for the climax in Part 5, the conquest of Mecca.
So when Meccan allies foolishly breached that 10-year peace treaty, all bets were off. Visually, if you look at the growth of the Muslim army over this period, it is staggering. We go from a persecuted few hundred hiding out in caves to a highly disciplined 10,000-strong army marching in total secrecy straight toward Mecca. And the craziest part of all, this monumental conquest was virtually bloodless. The overwhelming show of force made the Meccans surrender immediately. And instead of seeking brutal revenge for decades of torture, the Prophet granted a general amnesty to the entire city, forgiving even his fiercest lifelong enemies like Abu Sufyan.
But human nature is a funny thing, right? Immediately after taking Mecca, this newly combined, now 12,000-strong Muslim army got a little too arrogant. At the Battle of Hunain, their overconfidence walked them straight into a devastating ambush in a narrow valley. Absolute panic set in, and the massive army broke and fled. Yet the Prophet stood his ground almost entirely alone. He threw a handful of sand toward the enemy, which the texts describe as miraculously blinding them. This bought just enough time for the fleeing Muslims to rally, turn the tide, and ultimately secure a massive victory.
Finally, we arrive at our last chapter, Part 6, A New Global Power.
This marks the final major campaign during the Prophet's life, and it was the ultimate internal test of faith. Hearing news of a massive Roman invasion gathering, the Prophet called for a staggering 30,000 troops to march hundreds of miles. And they had to do this in the middle of extreme, deadly summer heat. A lot of people made up excuses to stay home, permanently exposing the so-called hypocrites within their own ranks. But the true, dedicated followers braved the brutal journey. And astonishingly, when they finally arrived at Tabuk, the immense Roman forces had just packed up and fled without even fighting. On the long walk back, a rogue assassination plot was uncovered and dismantled, completely cementing the internal unity of this brand new state.
So looking back at this epic 22-year journey, from those first quiet revelations in a cave, through brutal torture and impossible battles, all the way to a completely unified Arabia by 632 CE, it's a historical trajectory that just defies standard military logic. It leaves us with a truly profound question to chew on. Beyond the brilliant military tactics and beyond the clever treaties, what unbreakable internal convictions truly enabled such an unprecedented rise from 200 persecuted outcasts to a global superpower in barely 2 decades? Thanks so much for joining me on this Vishlation. I really hope it gave you a fresh perspective on this incredibly transformative era.